The UN Security Council has just passed a resolution demanding a ceasefire in Gaza. The exact wording is an immediate ceasefire for the month of Ramadan, which would mean both Israel and Hamas end hostilities starting now until at least April 9th.
14 votes in favor, 0 vote against, 1 abstention. The draft resolution has been adopted.
This success is notable because of how many past failures to agree there have been, 4 by my count. The abstention is also extraordinary. That's the United States, signaling a very fundamental break from Israel. And this has created some new rifts. It's all developing as I speak, but let's try to understand what's happened as best we can. The headline you'll see everywhere is UN votes for an immediate ceasefire. But that's actually just one of 3 parts of what the Security Council has agreed to. The second demand is for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. On October 7th, Hamas took more than 200 hostages. Today, best estimates are that they still have around 130 of them, hidden in their vast tunnel network. The UN wants them returned. The third demand is for what the UN calls the urgent need to expand the flow of humanitarian assistance. That's aid. The UN wants all barriers to providing aid at scale lifted, and it wants to see the people, the civilians of Gaza, protected.
To silence the guns is the only way to address the problems of the population in Gaza.
How do you do this, or any of this, exactly? That's not the purpose of the resolution. You'll rarely find those kinds of details in these kinds of agreements. They're more about signaling intent. And to secure that kind of consensus on this file, it hasn't been done before.
The United States stands with Israel. We will not ever fail to have their back.
Until now, Israel has been able to rely on the United States to veto all such resolutions for a ceasefire that have been tabled up until this point. It did so in November, in December, and again last month. But the relationship between Joe Biden and Benjamin Netanyahu has become more difficult. The U.S., too, has been under constant international and domestic pressure. It has mobilized warships, lost American sailors and soldiers in the Red Sea and beyond, and in the face of a climbing death toll in Gaza, more than 32,000, according to Gaza's health ministry, coupled with a humanitarian wasteland that has displaced nearly all of the 2 million Palestinians who live in the Gaza Strip, the U.S. calculation of how much war it can tolerate has changed.
The relationship is at its lowest ebb that it has been in 70 years. There is clear tension as Israel has resisted, if you're the Israeli government, defied, if you're in the United States. Pressure for an immediate ceasefire, pressure to dramatically increase the amount of humanitarian aid going into Gaza, and most importantly, pressure not to begin a military operation in Rafah.
The Americans actually proposed a similar ceasefire last week at the UN, and stop to consider just how profound a shift that is for a country that has been Israel's staunchest supporter. But that resolution was vetoed by Russia and China on Friday. The broad strokes of the resolution were the same.
We want to see an immediate and sustained ceasefire as part of a deal that leads to the release of all hostages being held by Hamas and other groups, and that will allow much more life-saving humanitarian aid to get into Gaza.
But in these resolutions, details matter. Russia objected because the resolution text wasn't tough enough. It declared only the imperative of an immediate and sustained ceasefire, which, in its view, wasn't technically calling for a ceasefire itself, just the need for one. Like I said, details matter. As this was happening, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken was in Israel, meeting with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The product of that talk, Netanyahu making clear that Israel's war machine needed to press on to defeat Hamas, and that was either with or without the Americans' help. By abstaining from the most recent UN vote, the U.S. has allowed it to succeed.
I think this abstention was meant to send the strongest possible message to the government of Israel that it cannot depend on unconditional U.S. diplomatic support.
The key thing to understand about this resolution is that it is heavy on symbolism. Neither Israel nor the Palestinians are members of the UN Security Council. They didn't have a vote. And enforcing a resolution that isn't obeyed gets complicated. There can be sanctions, embargoes, but it's hard to compel a government to do something it doesn't want to do. But the moral obligation. The UN Secretary General posted this on X. This resolution must be implemented. Failure would be unforgivable. This is very different from how Israel's defense minister sees things, that according to a new statement, their military has no moral right to stop.
I would expect that the government of Israel will release a statement. We will implement a ceasefire as soon as the hostages are released. In other words, it will take these two independent clauses and link them just as Hamas did on its side. The real impact will come from the negotiations that are going on in Doha.
What this does to the relationship between the US and Israel is unclear. Almost immediately, Israel declared it was canceling a planned trip to Washington, which was reportedly to discuss a ground invasion of Rafah, something Joe Biden opposes.
It seems like the Prime Minister's office is choosing to create a perception of daylight here when they don't need to do that.
But the US insisted, even after abstaining from this resolution for a ceasefire, that none of this was a shift in policy. Nothing's changed, they say. But the world's resolve to stop the war in Gaza has hardened.
After more than 5 months of a war of utter terror and destruction, a ceasefire is the difference between life and death for the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians.
One more thing. The goal of the resolution does stretch beyond just calling for an immediate ceasefire. It believes this should pave the way towards a permanent ceasefire.